Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this event in the Monash Law Chambers, and we recognise that we're holding this event on the unceded lands of the people of the Kulin Nations and pay our respects to their elders past and present. My name is Marilyn Pittard and I'm Professor of Law in the Monash Law faculty. This event has been a long time in the planning. Last year, under the leadership of our Dean, Professor Stephen Vaughan, we formed the Women's Network in Monash Law, and this is our first event, first main public event. So it's quite exciting for us to be having that event here. So I'm going to maximise the time for our panellists and our speakers. And what I'll do first of all is briefly introduce these panellists and then welcome our Deputy Chancellor onto the stage. So I'd like to welcome, starting from the end there, Deborah Glass OBE. I'm not going to say a lot about each panellist because you have a lovely blurb in your information about them, but suffice to say that Deborah is a distinguished public sector leader. She's the former Victorian Ombudsman, served for 10 years in that role and was the first female Ombudsman to be appointed. Then next along the line we have Raviana Sailo, who is a lawyer and community advocate. She's a founder of Sailo Inc. and she's a co-owner of Burmese House, which is a community-centred cafe and restaurant in Richmond. And I should say that all our panellists are alumni, distinguished alumni of Monash Law School. Then I'd like to introduce Jennifer Coate AO. She probably doesn't need an introduction to many of you because over 27 years she's held various judicial appointments from Magistrate, Chief, Deputy Chief Magistrate, Inaugural President of the Children's Court of Victoria, County Court Judge, and the first woman to be appointed as a State Coroner. And then we have, I'd like to welcome Tuanh Nguyen OAM, who is a leader in legal governance and risk, and she is the Chief Legal and Risk Officer at Virtus Health. She oversees legal, compliance, risk and government function across Australia, Europe and Asia. So I think you'll agree we've got a range of distinguished alumni who are going to be our panellists, and we're going to put some questions to them for discussion. First, we're going to hear from our Deputy Chancellor, who is Geraldine Johns-Putra. Geraldine is a corporate and commercial lawyer with over 25 years' experience. She runs her own legal practice that she founded in 2020 and supports organisations in the areas of modern slavery, ESG, compliance and so on. She is too a Monash alumna, a distinguished Monash alumna. She was originally an international student studying with us in law, and she's given back and is giving back a lot to Monash in so many ways. So I'd like to invite you, Geraldine, to the podium here to give an introduction. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Marilyn Pittard. Marilyn leads the engagement portfolio for the Faculty of Law. Good evening to our esteemed panel, to members of the faculty, including the Executive Dean, Professor Stephen Vaughan, students, alumni, distinguished guests, one and all. I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nations, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and on this occasion especially to Kulin women, who traditionally were holders of cultural knowledge and keepers of skills that were critical in supporting their peoples. It is really wonderful to see so many members of the Monash Law community here tonight. So I'm here to welcome you this evening, our Voices in Law panel and networking event for International Women's Day. And in doing so, I'm just going to step back a little bit into the recent past. Or for some of you, it's the distant past. It depends on your perspective. For those who were around in the 1990s, I invite you to come back to that time with me. Specifically 1992, I started at Monash Law as an undergraduate student in that year, and women were already entering Australian law schools in significant numbers at that time. By the mid-90s, women made up around half of all law students in Australia. It felt entirely natural to assume the profession was going to follow. So when I graduated, I entered the workforce in Australia with this fantastic Monash education, and I thought to myself, all I need to do is work hard, do good work, and the rest is going to take care of itself. I was ambitious. I wanted to be a partner in a law firm. I wanted the advancement, I wanted the credibility, I wanted the recognition. And the real world turned out to be a bit more complicated. At the time that I graduated, women were only about 10 to 12% of partners in Australian law firms. And why they were not quite reaching the top, the reasons were subtle, invisible, some call it unconscious. And not so long ago, actually, so this was quite a few years after I did graduate, I spoke with a senior lawyer, and she was struggling for years to be promoted to partnership. And she was a superb lawyer. She was experienced with her own client following. But her supervising partner didn't put her forward because he hadn't realized that she was the main breadwinner in her household. And until he realized that, he had assumed that she had a husband who would support her, and that there were other people in the firm, namely men, who needed the promotion more than she did. And then once he understood what her situation was, he promoted her. And merit was a secondary consideration in that decision. It's not so long ago. And there were other things. So I knew a firm, and a law firm, and this may or may not be autobiographical, where the female partners made an informal pact that they would go into the partners' dining room together. I don't know whether those things still exist, the partners' dining room. Rarefied atmosphere. But why did the female partners need to make this pact? Because you really didn't want to be the only woman in the room. Because the conversation was, there's no other word for it, the conversation was blokey. It was about sport, and there was the great Australian term banter, and there was always an edge to the conversation, and it felt competitive. It was about who could be the wittiest and the sharpest and who could give the best put-downs. And the women felt like they had no choice, they had to learn to speak that language. There's a Melbourne writer named Sarah Damodi. She wrote an essay called Power and the Feminine, and I loved it. She said she wrote it in 2017. She said if she had written it in 1997, and that's the year I graduated, she said she would have been exultant. She would have told everyone how the US had just appointed Madeleine Albright as its first female Secretary of State. And she'd have told everyone about Madeleine Albright's sage advice to women in power, which was this: never carry a purse. So you can go into meetings with your arms swinging, free, like a man. Apparently men don't carry bags, so I'm very sorry to break this to any male colleagues tonight who've come here with a bag. Miss Damodi bought a large black zipped folder with a man's brand, right? And she carried what she needed in it. And I had my own version. It was a briefcase, and it was black, and it was serious, and it said, business. Many of us were like that. We were trying to be men. I mean, remember the best-selling book in the 1990s full of career advice for women? It was called Nice Girls Don't Get the Corner Office. And the message was, forget about being yourself, behave like a man, and dress like a warrior. Power dressing, the structured blazer, the tailored trousers, etc., and the briefcase. It took me quite a while to understand something, and this brings me to tonight's panel. The women who are speaking to you this evening on this stage, they are not trying to be something that they're not. They're not putting on costumes. They're not adopting personae that don't fit. And I would go so far as to say that they are nice. But nice doesn't mean that they're not savvy, firm, formidable, and credible. Nice doesn't mean that they stand back or that they avoid calling out bad behavior. Nice does mean being respectful, responsible, and kind, while still owning and demonstrating a sharp mind, a courageous spirit, and a compassionate heart. And you would know this if you've heard Jennifer Coate speak about her work as state coroner, president of the Children's Court, and a commissioner in the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse. You would know this if you've read Deborah Glass's account of her time as state ombudsman, what fearless and independence looks like when you're the statutory watchdog of our state's political leadership. Or if you were in the room when Tuanh Nguyen spoke at a Monash graduation ceremony last year about practicing law with purpose and had the Robert Blackwood Hall in the palm of her hand. Or when you realize what Raviana Sailo has done already, just about a year out of law school, for social enterprises and advocacy, including for the Chin Myanmar community. What these women have done is change the environments that they operate in by being true to themselves, by applying their unique qualities and talents to their calling. In doing so, they give others permission to also be themselves. They give this permission to other women, including the many in this room who have benefited or will benefit from their trailblazing. They give it to men as well, because many men tell me that they also find this hyper-competitive, combative environments that I've been talking about just as suffocating. But due to societal pressure and a code of masculinity, they feel they must conform. So being yourself means being able to contribute your voice. A workplace or a community where diverse voices can speak up with authenticity is one where those voices can then gain the experience and maturity needed to deliver their wisdom. And then that collective wisdom benefits everyone. That's why diversity matters, and that's why tonight matters. I welcome you to enjoy the panel and the wisdom of our panelists. Please join me in welcoming the Honourable Jennifer Coate AO, Dr. Deborah Glass OBE, Tuanh Nguyen OAM, and Raviana Sailo.
Thank you so much, Geraldine. You've got us off to a very inspirational start for the evening, so I think it's going to be exciting to continue this conversation. I should also say that when the Women's Network was formed in the second half of last year, towards the end of the year, various people put their hands up to organise this event. So we have in this room Professor Gabriel Wolfe, who was also involved in organising this, Associate Professor Becky Battergol, and also Emily Collard, who's been very helpful in organising the event, and they're going to be participating as we go along in the evening. So we're going to start off with some questions for the panel, and the first thing I think which would be important to consider, for us to consider, is the theme of International Women's Day suggested by UN Women Australia, and that is balance the scales. So what we'd like to do now is to invite the various members of the panel to reflect on that theme, balance the scales, in relation to the legal profession and also to your own experiences. So you each have a microphone that you'll need to turn on when you address it, but I'm wondering, Deborah, can we start with you in answering this question or addressing this question?
Have I turned on my
You have?
microphone? Yes,
Perfect.
I have. Excellent. Thank you, Marilyn. It's a pleasure to be here and to see so many people, men and women. I'm happy to see a good gender mix around the audience too. So, like my fellow panellists, I did law at Monash, in my case back in the Ming Dynasty. So we don't need to go there. And I think it was even ahead of you, Jenny, but let's not go there either. So I went on to become an article clerk, as you did back in the day, and I knew on the very first day I was in this office in William Street, just down the road from here, that I did not want to be a lawyer. And it was something that was really apparent, and I suspect that many women of my generation would get this, that you've really felt you had to be better than a man to get to the same place. And although there were women of my generation who clearly did, and Jenny, you stayed, and you succeeded, and you did wonderful things. Marilyn Warren, Pamela here, there are so many women of my generation who stayed and stuck it out and showed that they could be at least as good as a man, if not 10 times better. But I just decided I didn't want to bother. So I left the country, and I was out for nearly 30 years. And I originally went one-way ticket, rucksack on my back, get me out of here. I don't want to be a lawyer. So it was, and I can tell lots of stories about it, but that's not what we're here to do tonight. But the funny thing was coming back to Australia nearly 30 years later as a member of the FW2 Club. And does anybody here tell me what the FW2 Club is? Jenny, you know, because you're a member of one as well. First woman to. First woman to be the Victorian Ombudsman. And I was really quite taken aback by this. And I'm thinking, really? And I kept getting asked, what does it feel like to be the first woman to do the job? And I would say, well, my mother would have been very proud, and I think actually one of the funniest things was that for my staff, it was really hard to get used to finding the ombudsman in the ladies' toilets because that was, because there'd be a hush, when I would appear in the loo. But I also thought, did it really take nearly 40 years to find a woman to do the job? Really? So you mentioned, Geraldine, you mentioned women's networks. You both mentioned women's networks. I was invited very early on to speak at a women's network, and I thought, why do they still have women's networks in Australia? Really? Do we need women's networks? And I was quite dismissive originally of this. And it took me a little while, but then I became a convert to realise why they were still so necessary. So I can compare, the situation of women in Australia to the UK and Switzerland and Hong Kong, but I'm not going to do that. I was really surprised coming back to find how much it is still an issue. It is still an issue it is still possible to find members of the FW2 Club. Here in the 21st century, we're still finding them. And I remember hearing Julia Gillard a few years ago, and she's also about my generation. And I heard her say, and it really resonated with me, that we thought we'd beaten it. We thought, our generation, we really thought we'd done the hard yards, we'd fought the battle for women's lib, we'd gone in there and we'd flown the flag and we had won. And we were so wrong. So yes, we need women's networks. Yes, we still need to talk about the kind of issues we're talking about tonight, because those scales are not balanced, and they need to be.
Deborah, thank you. Raviana, can we call on you, please?
So I'm thinking about what Deborah just spoke about, and it made me realise that we start wherever the other person leaves or wherever they left off, and that sacrifices are always made. So what I mean by that is I'm a Mizo woman. How many of you know what a Mizo woman is? Where do we come from? No one wants a guess? Okay. I'm a Mizo woman from Mizoram, and I haven't been back home since I was 8 years old, but I feel so proud. I feel the dreams that will never be realised by those who are still back home because of what's happening, right? And I'm here because another woman, my mother, was able to bring me here. She wasn't able to realise what she thought Australia would be for her. So I'm here to realise it for her. And it's interesting that Deborah said, you know, she's wondering what the Women Network, why do we still need this? And oftentimes I think we get to something and we're the first person to do it and we realise, well, it shouldn't be like this, right? So in my community, men or women, thankfully, I am the first lawyer. And it sounds very nice, especially when you put it on paper, but it doesn't mean much because for the outsider, you know, it's a big achievement, the first in the whole community. There's at least 50,000 of us, but I'm the first. Wow. Let's put that on a trophy. But for those, when I'm inside, all I have to see is, oh my goodness, I have to learn office politics because no one's taught me. I have to change the way that I speak because I speak different languages, and growing up I was told that the way that I speak was ratchet. I'm not sure if you know what that means. I don't know if that word is thrown around here, but growing up I was told that I spoke in a way that doesn't suit a lawyer. And my hair, I brought this up as well. For a long time I straightened it because it made me look more serious, more corporate, you know. So when I think about balancing the scales, I often think, well, how can we balance something that wasn't even, or there was an imbalance from the very beginning? How much weight can we put on one side to bring the other side up? How do we know, right? And I don't mean that to be, pessimistic? My fun fact, my mum said I was born with a bucket face. I think the translation there's a mistranslation. Essentially, it means that I was born with a scowl, essentially, and I always had a scowl on my face because I always seemed to see the negative in things or always asked why. And maybe that was why I became a lawyer, you know, because at the heart of law, as I understand it, is we ask why. And oftentimes women in different areas, in different communities, they're not allowed to ask why. And the fact that I can question and, you know, expect to be heard and be wrong, although I'm often right, you know, all these things are, I guess, privileges that I was able to have because of those who came before me and fought for this opportunity. So for me, when I think about balancing scales, I think, well, I don't know what the scale looks like, you know? I could be happy with what I have now because I have more than what those who came before me have ever had. But does that mean I stop working because those who come after me can have even more, right? So it's just like how I speak in circles. And I think that's essentially my answer to the question. Will we ever know? You know, will we ever know what the scale balance looks like? Because when that weight first came out, we weren't considered in the first place. It wasn't made for us. So what does it mean to have it balanced? Yeah. So I'll put that to you.
Thank you, Raviana. And Jennifer, can we hear your thoughts, please?
Certainly. As I'm listening to both Deborah and Raviana, I'm thinking to myself, I'm actually a case study on my journey through the law in not the scales balancing, because I don't think they are balanced as yet, but I think I came into the law at a time when the scales were starting to tip. So that's what I mean about myself as a bit of a case study. Let me just briefly outline why I say that. When I was in high school, at about the age of 16, I really confidentially said to one of my teachers that I thought I wanted to be a lawyer. And I'd never met a lawyer. I hadn't ever really been able to articulate where that thought was coming from. And it probably assists you to understand that I grew up on a housing commission estate out in Dandenong. Neither of my parents had gone to school beyond 14, and nobody at my school had a parent who was a lawyer, and I think probably no one had met one. My teacher very thoughtfully arranged for me to have contact with a local solicitor in Dandenong, and I spoke to him. I went to the appointment, I spoke to him and told him I wanted to be a lawyer. And he said to me, "Do your parents have any money?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Now listen, I don't want you to waste your time at university. If your parents don't have any money or any connections in the law and you're a woman, you'll never get a job in the law." I was absolutely devastated by that, and it took me a while to come back. I had a teaching studentship at that time, so I went off and became a teacher and worked as a teacher for a few years and taught out my bond. That will be a story familiar to some in this room. Anyway, I got back into the law school, history shows, and I got there in the 80s. In the 80s, there were no women on the benches of any state courts in Victoria. So when I was in law school, and I'm not that old, when I was in law school, there were no women on the state benches of our courts. By the time I was in practice in the mid-80s, women were just arriving into the magistrates' court. And by the time I was appointed into the magistrates' court myself, there were still, that was 1992, there were still no women on the benches of the Supreme Court. So our arrival is very, very recent. It took about 1,000 years to get there, literally. So when we talk about balancing the scales, it's worth thinking about those hundreds and hundreds of years before we arrived. It helps us understand why, and I think in what we've already heard so far, why we, and from that wonderful introduction from Geraldine, thank you, why we still feel like outsiders. We still feel like we have to justify and earn our place. A couple of little anecdotes from my own experience is that I remember those first few years when I arrived onto the benches of the various courts. I was constantly asked, "What do you think women bring to the role of magistrate or judge?" And I would diligently try and answer that and go through this list of qualities until I reached a point where I thought, why am I being asked that? I'm being asked that because I have to justify why I'm here. I don't automatically belong. So I stopped doing that and I started saying, here's my answer. You go and ask the men who are judges what qualities they bring to the bench. Come back with that list and ask me, and I'll tell you whether or not I think I match it. And just one other anecdote about where the scales sit. After I was appointed, it would have been to the first appointment onto the bench the second appointment into the county court. I remember bumping into a barrister that I knew reasonably well in the street who said to me, "You know, I don't think women make good judges or barristers." I said, "Okay, do you want to tell me why?" And he said, "Yes, I think your voices aren't strong enough. You're not able to command authority in the courtroom." And that particular chap, he's still there, and I'm sure he's got mates who think like him. So it's why I can say I don't think the scales are balanced yet, but we've come a long way. I think we can all accept we've come a long way, but there's no cause at the moment for any sense of satisfaction that we've arrived. We've certainly arrived into the positions. When we stop hearing about women being appointed women should be appointed, but of course on merit. We might be able to relax a little bit more, but when that stops happening, I might be able to relax a little bit more.
Thanks, Jennifer. It's interesting the point you make about the relatively recent appointments of women to the court, because it was only in the 1970s, early 1970s, that equal pay was granted to women. Previously, it would be advertised male earnings this salary, female this salary. So that also is relatively recent, and of course the gender pay gap still exists.
Women on juries.
Yes, women on juries, yes. Yes, it's another one, yes. Thank you. And Tuanh, we'd like to hear your reflections, please.
Yeah, thank you. Certainly, I think when I think about what the scales look like, your comment, Raviana, about what does the scale even look like, I think really resonated with me, because I think, I entered the law in the early 2000s after graduating from Monash Law School. Went straight into a global top-tier law firm as a corporate M&A lawyer. So, for me, in that experience, and I think for the bulk of my career as a corporate M&A lawyer, that experience of I'm an Asian female from the western suburbs, from a low socio-economic background. I didn't go to the private schools that the collective did. And walking into that sort of career and being in an environment where, you didn't have anyone who looked like me, who had the experience that I had, it was very immediate that whatever the system that I was walking into, it was not designed for people who were like me. And so when I think about that balancing of the scales, it's so many different facets of what makes up those scales. And I think your point around, actually, if they didn't even think about these elements, what does that scale actually even look like? So in terms of balancing the scale, I think for me that's a question of, I don't even know what the scale looks like. So have we actually balanced it? I think that's probably, a question for reflection. But for me, in thinking about that experience, that was, yes, I think in the early days, in the early 2000s and in the early part of my career, I was very much, to Geraldine's experience, you wanted to figure out how you're going to fit in that room, how you're going to present yourself, how you're going to dress, how you're going to speak. But I think over time, that sense of, I don't fit in here, but I don't enjoy this sense of not belonging and not being who I am, that actually drove my desire to create the change in that room. And so I think over time it was about, actually, how do I start advocating for change? How do I actually change this room? How do I actually elevate the voices of women, particularly culturally diverse women, which is it's an area that's very near and dear to my heart. And so thinking about it with that lens, I think has been a real driver in my career as I've progressed through. And so it then started with, how do I bring my authentic self to the room? This is me in my bright blue, and I'm more than happy to walk into a negotiation these days with my bright blue flowing dress. I don't need that black suit and the perfect hair and all of that to feel like I hold that space. But it has taken a long time to get to that place. But and I think, and I reflect over the last 20 years and the progress that's been made, even in my 20 years, and just adding to the progress that has been made to date. We have made progress. There's still a lot to be done, but in terms of getting to whatever that balancing the scale looks like, whether that's, people, women from different backgrounds with different experiences being able to feel like they belong and they have a voice, and that voice is heard in the rooms that they are present in. Maybe that's what that balancing the scale is. But I think for me, I'm optimistic that we are making progress, and there is absolutely opportunity to continue to do more. But when I think about days like today, it's wonderful that we're still continuing to acknowledge and to celebrate, but also to use this day to continue to remind us why that work still needs to be done, because the scales, however they look, still are not, it still hasn't been, quote unquote, balanced.
Thank you, Tuanh. Deborah and Raviana both mentioned, do we need a women's network? I'm going to broaden out that query a little bit further. We're having this Voices in Law event around International Women's Day. So maybe should we, in 2026, still be celebrating International Women's Day? It's celebrated all over the world. Monash itself had a huge number of functions celebrating Monash Women's Day. So why have a International Women's Day in 2026? Raviana, can I ask you, perhaps we'll ask the panel just to make a couple of brief points to that question. Raviana, can I start with you?
Oh, I was expecting Deborah to start again, so I was ready to piggyback off. No, okay, well, I am going to use what I've brought here to demonstrate my point, and so I can stay on topic. So this is called Totlo Puan. Totlo means to not be pushed back in Mizo societies and in Mizo language. And historically, the act of giving a scarf or putting a scarf on someone means you recognize them, as someone who has done a great deed for the people. And historically, it's often been men who've been given that. And when I was growing up, I've been serving the community since I was about 14, 15. Because my mum was an activist. We came here as refugees, and, because she believed in human rights. I don't know why she believed in that, she was a threat, and therefore she had to leave India. And because she became unwell and unfortunately couldn't see through her legacy, I wanted to step in. So I started serving the community when I was 14 years old. I'm 26 now, and I've become a lawyer. I own a business. I've started a non-profit, and this is not so that you can pat me on the back. It's just that in all these years, I've never been given a scarf. In all these years. And I've attended all these functions. And recently I attended one where one of my little brothers, he was dancing in our culture. One day maybe I'll dance for you. It's a way to welcome and honour the guests. And one of the hosts came up to me and said, shall I put a scarf on him? And I thought, for that? And since then I've thought, I'm not going to wait for you or anyone to put the scarf on me. I'm going to take it around and put it on myself. And I'm going to give it to myself. And I think that International Women's Day, it's moments like this, we do need to platform women, because they're often, regardless of how much they give, they're not honoured, they're not recognised. And when they ask, it sounds like they're bragging. But really, truly, if I don't speak about it, how would you know? And why do I have to, for example, people have told me, if you want to survive and thrive in a male-dominated industry, you need to become more like a man. Therefore, you need to be a bit more stoic. But how can I be stoic when all I've felt is low-key oppressed, And if I've been pushed down and down and down, you can imagine that when I get a chance to breathe, there will be a big gasp, So that's why, although I've learned to be more measured in the way that I speak, I don't want to lose my emotions, I don't want to lose my feelings, and I don't want to wait until I'm recognised that I've given back to my community or given back to this society. And oftentimes I've heard women who say, I don't want to be recognised because I'm a woman, I want to be recognised on my merit. Well, you're going to wait a long time then, hey, because apparently being a woman isn't good in the first place. So I know it's meant to be short, but I'll bring it down really quickly. One, oftentimes being a woman is seen as a disadvantage in the first place. So if it wasn't for days like this, weeks like this, platforms like this, people would continue to look at it as if we should be ashamed about it and we shouldn't celebrate, And it allows us, I think, to to be in spaces like just speaking with Jennifer today and hearing, Deborah and Tuanh speak. I feel like yes, I feel validated. So it's important to have days like this. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I think you've put the case absolutely beautifully. And I'm wondering what can really be added to that. So I'm just wondering if any of the other panellists feel they would like to add to that question, please do so. Otherwise, I'll hand over to my colleague Becky to continue the questions. Would anyone like
I'm just going to say yes, what she said.
Excellent. Deborah, yes?
Can I illustrate with a couple of short stories, very short? It's obvious why we still need it, but there are a couple of things that I think resonate with women. I'm going to mention the words imposter syndrome. Is there anybody who's not heard that term? No. Is there any man here who has experienced imposter syndrome?
Oh.
Okay. Is there any woman here who has not experienced imposter syndrome? Okay, there we are. Well, I think that now it's something that is still very current today. When I was leaving my last job as Deputy Chair of the Independent Police Complaints Commission of England and Wales, the job was only open to current commissioners. And there were 10 commissioners, 5 men and 5 women. And all of the men applied for the job, assuming that they would get it. Some of them had been in the role for about 5 minutes. And the most qualified person by far was one of the women who agonised about whether she should apply for the role because she only had 9 of the 10 criteria required. Whereas a man would think, I'm afraid, in this case they did, that I've got 1 or 2, so so I'm a shoo-in. Okay, so that's example number 1. Example number 2, which I do want to share with you, is money. Can I tell a money story? When those of you who are familiar with the UK, and I think the Dean here is one of them, public sector in the UK is very badly paid, right, Stephen? So when I took on my public sector role there, I actually took it on for the equivalent of what I was paying in tax when I was working in financial services. Very badly paid. So when I am coming back into the role of Ombudsman, where I'm having conversations with the Department of Premier and Cabinet about salary, I hadn't actually thought about this at all. And I really, whatever I was being paid was going to be a hell of a lot more than I was earning in the UK. But I remember that the previous Ombudsman had been a former head of Premier and Cabinet, and I figured he was fairly well paid. So I thought I'd ask a question. And I said, so when the salary was mentioned to me in a conversation, I said, just out of interest, I'm assuming that this is what my predecessor was being paid, because they wouldn't want to pay the first female ombudsman less than a man, would they? And there was a silence on the other end of the phone. And the guy said, let me get back to you on that. And I kid you not, later on that afternoon, I got another phone call and the salary had gone up, I can't remember whether it was 10 or 15%. So just as a coda to that, I took my girlfriends out on what I called the George Bounty, and that was another reason I established a scholarship at Monash with the balance. So there you go, money, just ask the question.
Thank you, Deborah. Tuanh, did you want to say anything about that?
Oh, look, Deborah, you stole my point about the imposter syndrome, because absolutely, I think, having these days, absolutely we need it, and it provides that platform to have these conversations about, what are the barriers, what's driving that inequity for women, and imposter syndrome is one area that's, to your point, I think there's probably not been a single woman that I've spoken to about this topic who will hand on heart say I've never experienced it. And so days like International Women's Day, it's not just about celebrating, but it's about providing the platform to have these conversations and to be able to share those experiences and go, hey, I'm actually not the only one who's sitting in this room going, crap, don't know what I'm doing and I don't belong here, and God, how did I get here, right? And I shouldn't be here. I think days like International Women's Day allow us to have that conversation, share those experiences, and collectively together find how we, come together and address it. So.
Thank you. I think you've all put a watertight case for continuing these events and make us feel vindicated in our decision to hold this event. Becky, my colleague Becky Battergole, has some questions she is dying to ask you, so I'll invite her to the podium.
I get to continue the cross-examination. So I'm really interested in asking you about ethics and your ethics as lawyers, and you have all had the benefit of a wonderful education in law, and we know that law is the language of power, and with power comes responsibility. And I'd love you to tell us about what you think are the responsibilities as legal professionals, not just you, but anyone, legal professionals of any gender, what the responsibility is to deal with inequality when you see it, whether it's within your own workplace, whether it's in the world, the broader world, whether it's social inequality. Tuanh, I'm wondering if maybe you could start with and tell us what you think.
Yeah, thank you. Look, I think as legal professionals, I think, we're in a really wonderful position of influence. And I think, with that influence, we've got the ability really to shape policy, to advise our clients around how they make decisions, designing sort of and really inputting into sort of frameworks that can really drive equity and advocate for that sort of inclusive policy setting. So, I mean, for me, when I think about my role as a legal professional, yes, there's my day job in advising on sort of day-to-day things, but I think there is a broader piece around advocating for policy settings that promote equity, inclusion and diversity. And I mean, I think about it just in my day-to-day role. I work for one of the largest IVF providers in the country, if not the world. And I think about the policy settings that exist in IVF. IVF is if you think about the patients that come through IVF, it's 100% of our patients are women. But the policy settings that exist in regulating IVF are not designed, were not designed by women and are not designed for women. There are still policy settings which make medical infertility a requirement for women to receive Medicare rebates for IVF services. So single women, same-sex female couples cannot access IVF in the same way as a, female in a heteronormal relationship. Surrogacy restrictions that exist, which are purportedly designed to protect women, but in fact exacerbate the disadvantage for women. When you think about surrogacy, everyone in the surrogacy supply chain is paid for their role in it, other than the female surrogate who has to bear the child. And in fact, it's actually illegal to pay them to do that. For a long time, the IVF laws did not allow, required women to be married in order to access IVF services. In some states, only just recently have they allowed single women and same-sex female couples to access IVF. So these are policy settings that exist in an industry that services one sex, the female sex, but it is very much certainly not designed to advantage the people that it services. And so when I think about even my day-to-day role as the Chief Legal and Risk Officer there, my role is to advocate in my position to government, to regulators, in how we start to shift the policy settings that regulate the industry to enable that and to facilitate greater equity and access and reshape that policy setting back for women. So that's an example of how I think as a legal professional we play that role in balancing, the system.
Thank you, Tuanh. Jenny?
Thanks. I want to just start with something that comes really out of the last question about the value of International Women's Day, but I think it probably has a place in answer to this question as well, Becky, which is we all, as keepers of the law and protectors of the law, really need to be clear that the pendulum could swing back at any given moment. And just look what's happening now. We have male politicians in this country telling us they want a return to the good old days, the days of traditional marriages, the days when women did not get equal pay for equal work, when women couldn't get loans from banks, when any number of inequities existed for women in particular inside married life, but in society more generally. So that's being spoken about in 2026 by those who would take back power and control in this country. So one of our responsibilities is to know that, understand that, and be the guardians of what we have in place to protect the rights of all. So it's the first thing. It's really an answer to both of those questions. The second thing I wanted to say is, over the years that I've been working in the areas of violence against women, sexual violence against women, family violence, sexual harassment, and the development and progress in the range of sexual assault laws, for example, that we have in place currently, when I walk into those environments where we're talking about what we can do, mostly there are women in the room. It's the women who are doing the work and they're doing the hard yards. But those areas are not the problem of women, they're a men's problem. And so what I would like to convey in answer to that question is, and there are terrific men out there doing good work, there's no doubt about that, and they're very important, but there needs to be more. Needs to be more men taking up that space and understanding, in particular, those that hold positions of power and influence, and that's what we lawyers do. We have knowledge that allows us to move in places where the majority of other people don't. So I'm saying to all men in our profession, step up. Step up and take that responsibility that you have. And one other related point is that we know from successive surveys in the legal profession that there still remains a view, and we've all touched upon it in various ways, I think on the panel and in Geraldine's introduction, there's still a view out there that what it takes to be a good lawyer is that aggressive competitive edge and intestinal fortitude. And what we generally hear attached to that is, and that's not something that women have. I've certainly had it told to me on a number of occasions, but I've seen those surveys coming back. And so I've thought about it a lot, and I've had the opportunity when sitting on that seat where one's constantly surveying the legal profession at work in courtrooms, that is so wrong, so ineffective, and completely undervalues, it completely misses, I should say, the qualities that really make a good lawyer, a good advocate, and a good judge. And it's not aggression and competitiveness. It's intelligence, emotional intelligence, hard work, good knowledge of the law, good communication skills. They're all gender-neutral qualities. They have nothing to do with being a male or a female. But we've all been led into this blind alley to think that that's what we should be striving for. So I want to call the end of that, and say that's not what we should be striving for. And I think it will actually help men and women as they go through the profession to take that view.
Thank you, Jenny. Raviana, what do you think the responsibilities are of a lawyer or lawyers to make a difference in the world?
I am going to piggyback off Jennifer's comment about moving in spaces other people don't. And I think back to the class I took with Becky, which is the reason why I'm here. And I think back to the opportunity that class gave me to go back to migrant communities, and in particular communities that they attach themselves wholly to the church or to the cultural community, you know. And for example, they won't even go see a doctor without consulting the elder of the church. You know, which hospital should, or which doctor, and blah 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 blah, all that. So I used the legal studies or the legal questions that I was provided there to go out and ask about, you know, family violence and reporting family violence. And I went with my big brain of being a law student, and I was like, all right, family violence time. But what does family violence mean to them? And as I was doing the research, I realized a lot of the community members, people I went to church with and people I grew up with, without even knowing, we've got this violence accepting attitude because it's so ingrained in us. You know, one of the anecdotes I remember was a family, there was the head being the father and the father's mother, and then his wife and children. And the wife knew that the dad was beating the children, and so did the grandma. So everyone knew, but no one was reporting it. The pastor knew as well. So everybody apparently knew, but it seemed that the people who should know and do something about it didn't and couldn't. So when I asked him, look, just for my studies, I won't tell anyone really, just you and me, tell me. It's like, well, if he goes to jail, no one here can work, you know. And to be honest, I grew up being hit and I'm fine, you know. And he's a good son. He's brought me to Australia, and he's brought his wife, his children. When he doesn't hit them, he's working hard for them, and they just need to understand that. And so what it takes a little bit of beating. So in moments like that, it's really hard, right? Because we can say what he's doing is wrong. You know, you should report him. But what they're talking about, genuine concerns, they feel their source of income or even, security will be gone if he's at risk, right? So one of the things I've thought about since then, is we might have taken what the law is for granted, or we don't even think too much about it. But the law can empower people. While I couldn't do much at that time with the families I was interviewing, at least through that interaction, we were able to recognize, you know, sure, you don't think what he's doing is wrong, but the law does recognize this to be family violence for this reason. And for you, although he may not hit you, the guilt that you bear seeing your children beaten and not knowing, just all this, the law recognizes that to be violence. And when you want to, have this conversation again, we can talk about it, and maybe once we talk about it, we can maybe do something more, but it's for you. It's for you to decide. And so move in places that people don't, right? For me, I realized that I don't need to work within a legal firm or be recognized as a lawyer at a firm to do the work that a lawyer should do. Because at the heart of it, law itself can be empowering for the lawyer and for the community, because we're asking why. Okay, like why do you just accept to be beaten? Does anyone here want to be beaten? Who here goes, I'm so excited, beat me? No, unless that's, unless a different conversation. But in all honesty, we don't want to be beaten, we want to feel safe. And even the option to be beaten in a safe place is okay, right? And the fact that for a lot of these women, their first experience and everyday experience is self-doubt. Self-doubt is a sign of humility. That's what we've been taught since day one, and finishing your sentences with a question mark. Oh, she's so feminine and humble. In our language, we've got the word klom ngai, and this is what defines all Mizo people. And oftentimes, klom ngai, that just means to put yourself below a man. Okay, never below another woman, but below a man. So if we've been taught since day one that in the man-made law, I know laws are man-made as well, but these communities create their own rules and they create protection or barriers and trick their people into thinking that the law doesn't actually apply to them. So we can actually go in there, and while we can't do something immediately, we can funnel their concerns and maybe even tell them a bit about the law is here for you as well, even if the pastor or even if the elder has said that it may not be for you. When you need it or when you need a different perspective, it's here and we can talk you through it. So, yeah, that's my answer to it.
Thank you, Raviana. And Deborah, what do you think the role of lawyers are in addressing inequality?
I don't really think of myself as a lawyer, to be honest. If I can answer that question simply as with a suggestion for all professions and anybody in managerial responsibilities, and that would be to enable men, empower men, I go on to say, to take on caring responsibilities. Because the reality is, unless men are able to take on a good solid share of caring and nurturing, women will never be free. And I remember in my office, this is about parental leave, practical things like that. One of my male staff took a year off on parental leave. It was deeply inconvenient. He's an investigator. But it was really important symbolically, as well as for him, obviously, to be able to say, good on you. Good on you for doing that. And that gets around. It's okay for other men to decide to take on parental leave. It's okay for a man to look after his children. That's really important. So, that way we really can achieve some practical balance. So, yeah, all managers actually have the capacity to achieve that change, and I encourage everyone here who has that ability to do that.
That is a simple and a clear and a practical thing that we can all do. Thank you, Deborah. So last question. I don't like keeping everyone here between the drinks and food that are out there. I'm going to give you each a time challenge. It's a 30-second answer. And I'm timing you to the question, if you had the opportunity, which woman, alive or not, would you like to have coffee with and why? 30 seconds. Jenny, would you mind starting? I'm just trying to share it around. Time starts now.
Without hesitation, that woman is Joan Baez for me. She's the soundtrack of the formative years of my life. I've watched her over many, many years perform with extraordinary courage and bravery in her areas of social activism, whilst being a superb singer and songwriter. And there she is still, all these years later, doing the same thing. I'd love the opportunity to sit down with her and talk to her and listen to her about what she's got to say about life and love and music and politics.
I'll join you for coffee. Tuanh?
Given me a real challenge for 30 seconds. It's my grandmother, my mum's mum. She was a working woman in South Vietnam, working for the US government, raising 6 kids with a naval doctor for a husband. She just had an extraordinary story. I didn't get to meet her because she died not long after the end of the war, in quite mysterious circumstances which involved communist soldiers, which I'm more than happy to share after, given I've only got 30 seconds. But I think just that story of her resilience, her strength, and there is a story around her decision to be loyal to my grandfather when they had to make the very difficult decision to turn around after being offered on one of the last airlifts out of Saigon before the fall, but to make the decision to turn around and not get on that plane and then have to endure life post-war. I think it's, there's an amazing story there, and I would love to be able to sit down and hear that. And yeah, so that's my quick 30 seconds.
Deborah, who would you have coffee with?
Well, funnily enough, in my case, it's my mother, who died 20 years ago this year, who was a formidable character, who was actually a trailblazer for women's equality in her generation, and who we never appreciate when they're alive. So, I say this to everybody present who still has a parent alive, particularly a mother alive. Make sure you get their stories. Make sure you really find out, because it'll be too late.
Thank you. Raviana?
I feel that challenge is particularly directed to me. No. No. I would want to have coffee with Jennifer Burnett, who's very much alive and probably down the road. But she was one of the first supervisors who really saw me and allowed me to cry on her jacket and give me legal advice without saying, "Well, toughen up. You're either made for law or you're not." And I think that from the first time I cried in her office to where I am now, to have someone who has seen me through those stages and to continue having these coffees, and with each coffee, I am, a different woman. It's really lovely to have a mirror to my legal career. So, yes, that's the person.
I think Jennifer would love to have coffee with you, and you should message her in the morning. I'm going to invite my colleague, Professor Gabrielle Wolfe, to come up and give a vote of thanks.
Thank you so much, firstly, to Geraldine for that great introduction and for emphasising the importance of women expressing their authentic and diverse voices. So thank you. And thank you to our wonderful panel for so eloquently and thoughtfully addressing the questions that we dreamt up and for sharing your personal experiences. It's interesting, a few people tonight have mentioned the gender pay gap, and when we were preparing our questions, I was sharing my own anecdote about how my mother used to say to me that when she started life as a teacher, she knew that she was getting a lower salary than her male colleagues, and yet she says no one questioned it. And it's just really interesting how it takes free-thinking, compassionate, courageous people to be able to stand sort of on the edge of society and to identify what's not okay and to address those challenges. And I think each of the people that you have heard from this evening, they are those people. And really have given us, I think, reasons for optimism that particularly people in the legal profession are in a very special position where they can really advocate for progressing towards greater gender equity, and as Jennifer made the point of also keeping vigilant for regression and sliding backwards. So I just want to thank everyone here, and also to say that I think I speak on behalf of everyone in saying we would all love to have a drink with each of you, and now's your chance. So please join us in the